This case takes place in the USA and spans over a number of years. Meet Maury Travis. Maury was born on the 25th of October 1965 in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, one of the major cities along the Mississippi River. He was raised in a poor area and lived on the breadline. There isn't much information to mention about his formative years, although his former teacher remembered him only because of how unusual he was. After graduating in 1985, he spent 2 years in the Army Reserve working as a medical and dental assistant. He later held various jobs, including working for trucking companies and volunteering at a nursing home. On the surface, nothing was alarming about his life, which is bizarre when we consider the deplorable and diabolical acts he later committed. It was in 1987 where his life began to unravel. He became addicted to crack cocaine, which was a habit that quickly spiraled out of control. By 1988, at the age of 23, his addiction had totally consumed him. He was spending as much as $300 a day on drugs, which led him to commit a series of robberies to pay for more drugs. In the span of 8 days, he robbed 5 shoe stores across the county. When the police eventually arrested him, he was neither aggressive nor hostile. Officers later described him as quite respectful. When he appeared in court, he claimed that his drug use had clouded his memory of the robberies. He pleaded for leniency, telling the judge that he had completed rehabilitation and was no longer using drugs after spending some time in jail before the trial. However, just months before his 24th birthday, a judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison. Around 2 months into the sentence, Maury sent a handwritten letter to the judge, pleading for reconsideration. He described prison as unbearable, saying that he cried himself to sleep most nights and his mental health was deteriorating. Suffice to say, the judge did not respond. After serving just over 5 years, Maury was released on parole. He was 29 years old, and the year was 1994. Those who interacted with him afterwards described him as polite and an unassuming man. A neighbor recalled how he would hum and sing when entering the shared basement of their building, making sure she knew he was there so he wouldn't startle her. Another neighbor, who often drank beer with him, said he never noticed anything strange about him, which is rather strange as he would soon become known as the Streetwalker Strangler. During the summers of 2000 and 2001, he was working as a waiter at a hotel restaurant. One day, a co-worker named Dave mentioned that a friend's stolen car had been found burned in East St. Louis. Maury didn't seem surprised. He casually remarked that East St. Louis was a good place to dump things because the police didn't patrol the area often. Dave thought to himself. He thought that this was a strange comment to make. Why would Maury be an expert on knowing where the police didn't patrol? This made the colleague rather suspicious of him. Maury also had a girlfriend, a woman named Julie. At the time, Julie was working as an intern for KDL News, and she remembers Maury saying something rather disturbing. Maury turned to Julie and asked her if the station had ever done a story on the escorts who were being murdered at the time. From 2000 to 2001, several escorts were found dead, dumped in East St. Louis and other areas. However, this wasn't public knowledge yet. The police had decided to not yet tell the media. Whilst Maury was talking to his girlfriend, he referred to this person as a serial killer. Julie found the information strange but intriguing. It pricked her journalistic senses, and she pitched the idea to her boss at the station. However, the boss had no idea about these murders yet. Less than 3 months later, the police publicly announced that a serial killer had likely been preying on escorts in that area. These were African American women who were addicted to drugs and often living on the streets. In St. Louis, the common area known for its crack houses was called the Stroll. People who hang around the Stroll can be seen walking the streets for days on end. They have matted hair and wear the same clothing for weeks at a time. These women have no permanent or safe residences. They were exposed and at the mercy of their next customers. They worked so they could buy more illegal substances, and Maury Travis knew this area. He knew it for the access to drugs and the access to vulnerable victims. The serial killer who had been preying on these women was in fact Maury Travis. Still to this day, there is no timeline of events, but it is suspected that Maury went on a killing spree from the 19th of March 2000 to the day of his arrest 2 years later. What we do know is his clear modus operandi. First, Maury would cruise up the stroll, eyeing up the local women of the night, most of which were African American, just as Maury desired. Once he had his mind set on one of the women, he would approach them. He came across nice, polite, and like any other person seeking their services. Only, he was not like anyone else. What he intended to do was beyond imaginable. After some small talk during a ride home to his house in Ferguson, he would welcome them into his house. What's strange is that he filmed these interactions. First, he would give them some illegal substances and then sleep with them in his bedroom. Once he had had his fill, he turned to satisfy a more darker need. He now made them engage in ritual-like activities. He brought one victim into his living room, made her change into a white dress, before placing sunglasses on her face. Still to this day, nobody quite knows why he did these strange things. And then, when the women are least expecting it, he would pull out an extremely powerful taser and shock the victim just below the collarbone, rendering them completely incapacitated. He then grabbed the women by the legs and dragged them through his house into the basement, which was later named his torture chamber. The police recall watching the footage at a later date, hearing the bodies bang along the staircase as he dragged them down into his lair. Maury's demeanor then rapidly changed. He became hostile, combative, and very degrading. There was a single thick wooden column in the center of the torture chamber, which he would use to restrain the women against. He would strip them completely naked and handcuff their hands and feet behind them around the column, leaving them on their knees. Maury then began interrogating them, asking them who's looking after their children. He made his point very clear. These women were to him subhuman for putting drugs and their jobs before their children. He even filmed them asking if they wanted to say anything to their children. The women would then endure further humiliation and torture over the course of several days. He would beat them black and blue. He would lacerate the women with kitchen utensils, drawing blood which would spray across the basement, and he cared very little for cleaning up. After killing a victim, Maury would extract something from them, an item of clothing or a piece of jewelry, anything to keep as a souvenir. Next, he would eject any films he had made in his camcorder and place them in a safe spacing in the cavity of his dungeon wall. He would then discard the bodies in a wide range of locations. A 34-year-old woman by the name of Alyssa Greenwade was one of his victims. She lived on the stroll and was found dead in Washington Park on the 1st of April 2001, with strangulation marks around her neck. Teresa Wilson, aged 36, was found dead by strangulation in a ditch off Highway 67 on the 15th of May 2001. Betty James, aged 46, was found on the 23rd of May 2001 and was one of the women who starred in Maury's graphic tapes. She was one of the only victims who stated her real name when she was asked on camera. She was also found with tire marks across her legs, indicating that Maury had run her over at some point. Then, on the 29th of June 2001, only 16 feet from where Teresa was found, was the body of Verona Thompson, who was aged 36. Then, on the 25th of August 2001, a decomposing 50-year-old woman named Yvonne Cruz was found strangled and tortured to death. Then there was 33-year-old Brenda Beasley, who was also strangled and dumped in some garbage only a few months later. Brenda and Yvonne had DNA inside their private parts from the same male. This was later discovered to be Maury's. The list continued with a series of discovered skeletal remains which proved little information with regard to the manner of their death. Maury had no regard for his victims. Teresa Wilson was a mother to a daughter called Chastity. She would take her daughter to the spot where she would meet her clientele. They would both sit on a bench next to a payphone. When Teresa had a client, she would leave her daughter on a bench for up to an hour and then return. So when Maury drove up to Teresa, he took her mother knowing that he was going to end her life. Chastity sat and waited for her mother for hours, ultimately for her to never return. He saw these women as trash, so much so that he dumped many of his victims in heavily vegetated areas of highways and mostly in East St. Louis. Some of the bodies were found discarded in illegal dumping sites, buried beneath piles of garbage. Over this period, the police were finding bodies nearly every 6 weeks. The police theorized that the killing was at the hands of the same perpetrator, but unfortunately for the longest time, there were no leads. Homicide investigators from Illinois and Missouri police and the FBI joined forces and created a task force. But again, more bodies appeared, having undergone a brutal, degrading murder with the same modus operandi. The task force thought that the murderer was arrogant, as he would sometimes leave the bodies to be easily discovered. At first, they thought the profile of the killer would be a white male trucker, as many of the bodies were left along roads just outside the city. But as more and more bodies turned up, they believed it was a man who was familiar with the area. Early into the investigation, Maury Travis was dubbed the Streetwalker Killer. It took several months before the news outlets started reporting on these murders. A journalist named Bill Smith wrote a heartfelt and bold front-page piece on the women who had been killed. He saw that these vulnerable women who had been murdered were being forgotten about, as very few people came forward to identify the bodies. He saw it as a complete injustice, and believed that this would empower the killer to continue. But just 5 days later, Bill received a peculiar letter in his work mailbox. Bill opened the letter and read the first line. It read, "Nice sub-story about Teresa." But then Bill read on. It said, "Write a good story about Greenwade and I'll tell you where the other bodies are. To prove I'm real, here's directions to victim number 17. A map was provided with the letter X marking the spot. The letter was handed over to the task force. Just as it described, Alyssa was found at the marked location on a map provided to Bill. However, the police now had a lead. Maury had used an online digital map to send to Bill. A team of expert digital forensic analysts was assembled to track down the online map that Maury had used to direct Bill to Alyssa's body. The police knew there was only a 5-day window between the initial news report and the day that Bill received the letter. Their task was clear. Find the exact map online and determine who had accessed it within that time frame. The map was from Expedia.com, which exclusively used maps from Microsoft. The police reached out to Microsoft for user data, but the company was reluctant to cooperate. But a subpoena was issued, and Microsoft handed over the data. The map in question covered a small specific section of St. Louis. The police hoped that the number of users who had accessed it during the 5-day window could be minimal. And they were right. Only one computer had downloaded that very section of the map. Tracing the IP address led them to an MSN account registered under the username Maury Travis. This name brought them to a property where Maury had been living, the house which sat atop his murder dungeon. On the 7th of June 2002, Sergeant Tom Sachs of the St. Louis Police Force headed to Maury's residence in Ferguson in the morning. After banging on the door, the officer was met by a riled-up Maury Travis and his girlfriend. Maury's first words to the police officer was, "It's 7 o'clock in the morning." Tim Sachs replied and said, "Yeah, you're right, and here's a search warrant." Maury then said, "Why do you need to search my house?" And Tim replied by saying, "You know exactly why we're here." The police believed that they had caught the streetwalker strangler, but what they didn't expect was the sheer volume of evidence waiting for them. The police searched the house and quickly realized that they had uncovered something far worse than they had anticipated. They found the computer they were looking for, but they also found women's wigs, pairs of high heels, jewelry, and a stun gun locked in the desk drawer. They even found a book on how to conduct torture and articles regarding his victims. Within the walls of the torture chamber were a collection of homemade videotapes. One videotape was labelled The Wedding Day. This had several edits and cuts which showed Maury torturing, abusing, and forcing himself upon different women. A moment later, it cut to a part where he is killing Cassandra Walker. You can see how she was chained up to a wooden central pillar in the basement. Her legs and hands are restrained, and she is pleading with him to let her go. In that moment, he picks up a belt and strangles her to death. Now, what exactly happened on these tapes was so disturbing that each officer that reviewed the tapes was given psychological treatment after. They were described as beyond twisted and horrifically graphic. The basement painted an even darker picture. The police uncovered a makeshift prison cell. Blood covered the walls, ceiling, doors, and the carpet. Even the furniture was stained red. This was the setting for most of these videotapes that he had made. Investigators searching Maury's home found a crude diagram detailing plans for a basement extension. He intended to build 2 prison cells where he would chain up his victims, and the plans were incredibly well thought out. They included air vents for the basements, ensuring ventilation. He wanted to make sure it was well concealed, so he drew crawl ports instead of doors. Since there was no bathroom facilities, he made a list of supplies which included adult diapers. It was clear that he was preparing to keep women captive for an extended period of time, inferring he must have gotten bored of his current methods. It turned out that Maury's girlfriend had no idea what was going on in the house she lived in, or what Maury had planned. She swore that she had never gone into the basement, and that the basement was for Maury only. Maury was questioned for 4 hours on his sofa before being taken in for interrogation. Initially, he was arrested on kidnapping charges linked to 2 victims, Betty James and Alyssa Greenwade. Investigators then matched tire tracks on Betty's leg. They were linked to Maury's car. It was now a priority for the police to identify and locate the other victims who were in these tapes, and whose DNA covered the basement in the form of bloodstains. But Maury, he wasn't cooperating. There was no emotion, no guilt, no remorse. He was described by the police officers as nothing but a monster. He sat there unfazed, asking the police officers how they had found him. His arrogance was unsettling. He even remarked that the interviewer was boring and that he wanted to have someone more challenging. Maury seemed unable to believe that he had finally been caught. But then the police revealed that it was the letter to Bill Smith that led to him being apprehended. And with this, his demeanor shifted. He drummed his fingers on the table restlessly. His body shifted in the chair, sliding back and forth, and he further refused to cooperate. Maury was then placed in a super maximum jail cell and was placed on round-the-clock observations. This is a common practice for criminals who may face the death penalty. Observations were scheduled for every 15 minutes. But on the 10th of June 2002, guards at the St. Louis County Jail found Maury dead in his cell. He had been able to create a makeshift noose, and 2 consecutive checks had been missed. In those 45 minutes, he had enough time to tear a strip from his bedsheet, thread it through an air vent above the toilet, and end it all. He even managed to restrain his own hands behind his back, preventing himself from instinctively fighting for survival. Inside his cell, they found a note addressed to his mother. It read, "Dear Mum, I'm sorry for the pain I have caused you and the family. My death seems to be the only way out, and a fast end to all of this publicity. You were the best mother a man could have, but I've been sick in the head for a long time, since I was around 14. I don't know why, I was just sick. I have never felt normal or happy at any time in my life. This seems to be the best solution for all involved, especially me, because I don't want to spend the rest of my life locked up, or worse, let them kill me with a needle. Tell Grandma, Marina, James and everybody that I love them dearly. but I love you the most. Forever your son, Maury Travis. The investigators who analysed the note saw no admission of guilt for the murders. They also believed that a significant event pushed him towards becoming a cold-blooded killer around the age of 14. But when detectives interviewed those who knew him, they found nothing. No signs of childhood trauma, or any trauma for that matter. No clear trigger that could explain his descent into murder. Unfortunately, Maury never faced trial. He never stood before the families of the women he manipulated, humiliated, and destroyed. By the time of his death, the police had linked him to 12 victims, but in his own words, there were at least 17. Detectives in the surrounding counties have suspected that he might be the murderer in several other cases, increasing the potential murder count to over 20. The strongest theory suggests that he had a deep hatred for women who sold their bodies, but no one can say for sure. The case of Maury Travis remains a puzzle unsolved. His motives were never fully understood.